The winter of 1941 settled over the outskirts of Krakow, with a weight that felt older than the war itself, a heavy quiet that pressed against the brick walls of the small public school on Ulika Świerkowa. The snow came early that year, drifting against the windows in slow, deliberate waves, muting the sounds of the street and turning the schoolyard into a white, motionless plain. Inside the building, the hallways still smelled faintly of chalk and wet wool coats, as if the rhythm of childhood had tried, desperately, to survive the occupation. Yet every echo felt strained, uncertain, as though the very air knew that something irreversible hovered just ahead. The teachers moved differently now, their voices softer, their glances sharper, their steps careful and measured in a world where a wrong breath could carry consequences. And still, the children gathered each morning, clutching their notebooks, their fingertips red from the cold, unaware that they were walking deeper into the pages of a history that would attempt to erase them. It was near the end of November when the German-appointed school inspector arrived unannounced, flanked by two soldiers whose boots tracked melting snow across the wooden floor. His presence disrupted the brittle calm that had settled over the classrooms, and whispers traveled through the building like a tremor. The inspector requested access to what he called records, though everyone in the faculty understood what he really sought. Lists, names, birthplaces, lineages, the machinery of categorization that had already swallowed neighborhoods and would soon swallow cities. Even so, the school principal complied with trembling hands, retrieving folders that felt heavier than they should have. The inspector flipped through them with mechanical detachment before ordering the principal to summon Class 3B to the assembly hall. The children filed in moments later, a cluster of wool coats and chapped cheeks, some smiling nervously, others too young to recognize the tension. Their teacher, Helena Gradowska, stood behind them, her eyes flicking from the inspector to the soldiers with a calmness she did not feel. She was only 28, too young to have known the last war, and too old to be spared the weight of this one. The inspector looked at her for a long moment, then at the children, as though memorizing the scene for reasons no one in the room would understand until much later. It is here, within this silence, that the only surviving photograph of that class was taken. A single flash, quick and clinical, captured the 21 children standing shoulder to shoulder in the dim light of the assembly hall. Some smiled out of instinct, others looked confused, and a few stared directly into the lens with expressions that now, decades later, seem almost prophetic in their solemnity.
At the center of the group was a boy named Dawid, whose dark eyes held a depth far beyond his 9 years. On the left stood little Elżbieta, clutching the sleeve of her friend Anka, and standing just behind them, tall and stoic, was Helena, her hands folded tightly at her waist. That photograph should have been just another wartime relic, a still frame lost among thousands taken by occupying forces for purposes that shifted like shadows.
But this one would become different, because it would become the only proof that Class 3B existed at all. The inspector offered no explanation as he dismissed the children back to their classroom. The day continued, though its normalcy had been fractured. Lessons resumed, pencils scratched across paper, and Helena tried to steady her voice as she spoke of arithmetic and winter folklore, anything to keep the children anchored in the familiar. But the walls felt thinner now, as though the world outside had pressed closer. The wind rattled the final bell, and the children ran into the snow, their laughter rising for a moment before dissolving into the cold air. No one knew that it would be their last day. For 3 nights, the school sat in uneasy quiet, its windows dark, its halls empty. Rumors swirled through the neighborhood, faint and inconsistent. Some said German trucks had been seen near the river. Others claimed the children had been moved to another facility for testing, registration, labor preparation, words that lost meaning when applied to children so small. A few whispered that perhaps it had been a misunderstanding, the kind that wartime bureaucracy could swallow and later regurgitate, with an apology no one would believe. But none of these rumors survived the dawn of the fourth day, when the truth emerged in the form of silence, so complete it suffocated every hope. The children of Class 3B had vanished, not relocated, not transferred, not reassigned to another school, vanished. Their homes had been visited the night after the inspector's arrival, families awakened by pounding on doors, flashlights slicing through rooms, orders barked with cold precision. Parents were separated from their children, questioned in kitchens still warm from evening tea, and warned not to search, not to ask, not to speak. The soldiers left quickly after taking the children, leaving behind open doors that allowed the night air to spill into hallways where small shoes still lay near the threshold. Helena Gradowska tried to intervene, rushing through the snow as she moved from house to house, pleading for answers. But each door she reached revealed the same scene: mothers sobbing into their hands, fathers staring blankly at walls, siblings huddled together in confusion. The truth settled upon the neighborhood like frost. 21 children had been taken by soldiers who offered no documents, no reasons, not even a pretense of legality. They simply removed the children from their beds and disappeared into the dark. The school closed the following morning. Officials boarded its doors without explanation. The swings in the yard hung motionless in the wind, their seats dusted with snow, as though waiting for the children to return. But they never would. 77 years later, in early 2018, a small cardboard envelope appeared in the mailroom of a Krakow historical society. No return address, no explanation. Inside was a single black and white photograph, the class portrait of 3B, taken that cold November morning in 1941. The image was crisp, preserved with unusual care. On the back was a message written in German in a shaking hand. It said only, "Forgive me, they were not meant to be forgotten. Who sent the photograph remains a mystery." Some speculated it was the inspector himself, now an old man haunted by what he had witnessed. Others theorized it had come from the family of a soldier, someone who had discovered the photo tucked inside a journal or box of wartime belongings. But no definitive answer emerged. The reappearance of the photograph rekindled questions the city had long tried to bury. What happened to the children? Why was their class singled out? Why had no records survived, no testimonies emerged, no trace of their fate been found in archives that documented the war with obsessive precision? The questions grew louder, spreading through newspapers, online forums, and community meetings. People wanted answers. People wanted closure. But the photograph only deepened the mystery, offering a reminder of the lives erased and the silence that followed. And maybe this is the moment for a brief pause, a moment where the present brushes lightly against the past. As you watch this unfolding story, sitting wherever you may be in the world, I invite you to leave a comment below. Tell me, from where are you watching this video? Your voice, your presence, becomes a small act of witness to a story nearly lost to time. The discovery of the photograph marked the beginning of a renewed investigation. Researchers sifted through archival documents, traced surviving families, and mapped troop movements from that winter. But every trail fragmented, as though the event had been deliberately excised from the historical record. Some believed the children had been sent to a labor farm deep in the general government territory. Others suspected they had been part of medical experiments, moved through clandestine routes that erased all documentation. A more sinister theory suggested that the class had been taken as retaliation for resistance activities in the area. Their disappearance meant to warn the community into submission. Yet even these theories lacked evidence. The truth, or something like truth, lay beyond reach, shrouded in the same cold darkness that had swallowed the children on that winter night. As interest surged, historians began reconstructing the timeline of events leading to the disappearance. They found that Class 3B included children from mixed families, some Catholic, some Jewish, some Romani, and others whose ancestry blurred through generations of migration. Their demographics matched no single policy or directive of the occupying forces, making their abduction even more perplexing. This diversity suggested intent beyond registration or segregation. Whatever happened to them had been orchestrated with unusual secrecy, perhaps by a faction operating outside conventional channels. Helena's name surfaced repeatedly in interviews. Although she had survived the war, she died in 1978 without leaving written testimony. Neighbors remembered her as quiet, withdrawn, haunted by memories no one could fully understand. She never married, never taught again, and rarely spoke of the war. Those who knew her said she kept a small tin box in her dresser, locked with a key she wore on a chain around her neck. After her death, the box was found empty. By the time journalists revisited her story in 2018, her apartment had been renovated several times, and any remnants of her past life had been swept away. All that remained was her role in that photograph, standing behind her class in a moment captured seconds before oblivion. The photograph's existence raised a final unsettling possibility that someone had always known what happened, someone who kept the image hidden for decades, someone who watched as families searched for answers, as archives expanded, as the world tried to make sense of a crime no one dared name. And only when age or guilt or fear compelled them did they release the photograph into the world. This is merely the threshold of the story, a faint outline of a tragedy that spans continents and decades. The true search begins now, as we trace the shadows cast by that single image and unravel the chain of events that followed the disappearance of Class 3B. It is a story carved into silence, carried by ghosts, and now returned to the living. Before we move on, if the atmosphere has drawn you into this investigation, and you wish to follow every unsettling turn, I invite you to subscribe. In a place where forgotten stories finally speak, your presence matters. The photograph spread quietly at first, a curiosity shared among local historians and archivists in Krakow before it began to ripple outward into the wider world. It appeared on small online forums dedicated to wartime history, where users debated its authenticity, speculated about the fates of the children, and analyzed every corner of the image with forensic obsession. They magnified faces, enhanced shadows, and traced reflections in the glass windows behind the group. Searching for hidden symbols or figures, someone even noticed what appeared to be the faint outline of another person standing just beyond the frame. An adult figure, blurred, half cut by the edge of the photograph. Who it was, no one could say. Some thought it might have been the inspector. Others claimed it was a second photographer, part of a documentation unit. But the more the image was studied, the more questions it created, as if it resisted understanding, as if it had been taken not to reveal, but to conceal. Soon the story reached international audiences. Newspapers printed the photograph on their front pages, beneath headlines that spoke of rediscovered horrors and wartime enigmas. Documentaries were proposed, University departments began inquiries, and survivors' groups held vigils in the memory of the missing children, though their names had long vanished from official records. The Polish Institute of National Remembrance opened an internal investigation, assigning 2 historians to re-examine Nazi occupation documents from 1941. Among the yellowed pages, they discovered references to Educational Relocation Initiative 12, a bureaucratic phrase that appeared in several memos signed by mid-level German officials. The initiative's purpose was unclear, its files mostly destroyed, but its timing and location corresponded precisely with the disappearance of Class B. The surviving documents suggested that a number of children were to be evaluated for suitability, a euphemism often used in German administrative correspondence of the time. Suitability for what? The question remained open. Some believed it referred to racial classification, the Nazi policy of identifying children who met certain Aryan criteria for adoption into German families. Others suspected a darker meaning: experimentation, sterilization, or psychological testing conducted under the guise of education. Whatever its purpose, Initiative 12 seemed to have operated outside conventional military channels, under the supervision of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Security Main Office, notorious for its secret programs. Meanwhile, the photograph itself became an object of pilgrimage. People visited the Krakow Historical Society to see it in person, though it was displayed only briefly before being transferred to climate-controlled storage. Even behind glass, the image seemed to carry an unease that lingered in the air. Visitors often reported an inexplicable feeling of being watched, a sensation that intensified when standing before the photo for too long. The archivist responsible for its preservation later described how the temperature in the storage room would sometimes drop suddenly when the photo was handled, as though the cold of that 1941 winter had somehow been sealed inside the print. What the public didn't know was that in the weeks following its arrival, the Historical Society began receiving letters, unsigned, written in English, French, and German, all referencing the same photograph. Each letter contained a short message, typed or written in shaky cursive, hinting that others like it exist. One said, "They were photographed in 4 cities. Only Krakow has spoken." Another read, "Look for the man with the gray hat. He always stands behind the teacher." Investigators initially dismissed the letters as pranks inspired by media attention. But then, in February 2019, another photograph surfaced, this time in France. The discovery came from an attic in Rouen, where a family clearing the belongings of a deceased relative found an envelope marked École des Enfants Déplacés, 1942. Inside was a photograph nearly identical in composition to the Krakow image: a teacher, 2 soldiers in the background, and a group of children standing in orderly rows. Different faces, different uniforms, but the same strange symmetry, the same faint shadow at the edge of the frame, an indistinct figure in a gray hat, half visible, looking toward the camera. When the 2 photographs were compared, experts noticed an unsettling similarity. Both had been taken with the same type of German camera, a Contax 2, and both carried the same manufacturer's watermark on the back. The coincidence was too precise to ignore. Historians began connecting the dots, uncovering a possible network of relocation schools established under Nazi occupation across Eastern and Western Europe. Each institution appeared briefly in local records, operating for only a few months before disappearing entirely, leaving behind no staff lists, no student registries, and no closure reports. It was as if they had been constructed solely to collect children, document them, and then vanish. Witnesses were rare and fragmented. An elderly man in Hungary recalled a traveling inspector who visited his village school in 1942, photographing the students before taking several away for selection. In Germany, post-war interrogations of SS officers occasionally mentioned youth transfer programs, though details were vague and often redacted. Still, even as new fragments emerged, the story of Class 3B remained the most haunting, because unlike the other schools, Krakow's children were never absorbed into any known German institution, nor did they appear in post-war adoption records. It was as if they had been erased mid-sentence, their existence suspended in the frozen air of that single photograph. One of the historians assigned to the case, Dr. Aneta Wilczek, became consumed by the mystery. She was a woman known for her precision, for her refusal to speculate. Yet this case began to erode that discipline. She spent long nights in her office, surrounded by maps and photocopies, tracing troop movements and railway lines. Eventually, she began to notice patterns. Several small transport routes, unrecorded by official German rail logs, appeared to connect Krakow with a remote facility in the Sudeten Mountains, near what is now the Czech border. The site, referred to in a few surviving documents as Kinderlager Steinwald, or Children's Camp Steinwald, had been destroyed near the end of the war. No photographs of it survived, only fragments of building plans and requisition forms for food and medical supplies. But among these fragments, Wilczek found a shipment order dated December 3, 1941, 4 days after the disappearance of Class 3B, requesting 21 educational subjects, Krakow district. Her hands shook as she read it. The document confirmed the transfer of children from Krakow to Steinwald under the supervision of a man identified only as Obersturmführer H.F. The same initials appeared in another memo, one found decades earlier in German archives during unrelated research. That document had described H.F. as head of Program Grau, a sub-initiative of the SS Ahnenerbe, an organization infamous for pseudo-scientific experiments attempting to trace the origins of the Aryan race. The implications were horrifying. Program Grau was believed to involve sensory deprivation and language isolation studies conducted on children, designed to test theories about innate communication and the purity of linguistic instinct. None of its research survived, or so historians had believed. When Wilczek presented her findings at a closed symposium, the reaction was explosive. Some dismissed her theory as speculative, others accused her of sensationalism. But her evidence was meticulous, the documents genuine. If Class 3B had been part of Program Grau, their disappearance was not random. It was systemic, deliberate, and if the photograph re-emerged after 77 years, it could mean that someone connected to that program had preserved it intentionally, perhaps as a record, perhaps as a confession. The weight of that possibility began to haunt Wilczek's nights. She started receiving emails from anonymous senders warning her to stop digging, to let the children rest. Her phone would ring in the early hours of the morning, only to be met with silence on the other end. Once, she returned to her office to find the photograph missing from her desk, though the lock on her filing cabinet remained unbroken. It was found the next day in the building's basement, propped against a wall as if someone had been examining it in secret. After that, Wilczek stopped working late alone. Yet she couldn't stop, because each new detail, each fragment, drew her closer to the sense that the truth was still alive somewhere, buried but breathing. By summer 2019, she made a decision that would alter the investigation's course. Without official authorization, she traveled to the region once known as Steinwald, now a stretch of dense forest straddling the Polish-Czech border. Locals avoided the area, saying it was haunted, that birds never sang there, and that fog lingered unnaturally between the trees. The ruins of a concrete foundation remained, swallowed by moss and silence. Beneath the soil, Wilczek found shards of porcelain, fragments of rusted barbed wire, and what appeared to be the remnants of a small child's shoe. She didn't inform the authorities immediately. Instead, she returned twice more, photographing the site, taking samples, documenting everything with obsessive care. And on her third visit, she found something else. A piece of paper, brittle and water-stained, half buried in the dirt. The ink was nearly gone, but faint German script remained visible. It read, Die dritte Klasse, fertiggestellt. The third class, completed. That night she sat alone in her car on the road out of the forest, her hands trembling as she looked at the photograph of Class 3B once more. The faces of the children seemed to shift in the dim light, their expressions unreadable. She could no longer tell if it was her imagination or something else moving through the grain of the image, something that refused to stay still. If you're still here, still following this story into its deepening cold, don't forget to like this video. It helps bring forgotten voices back to the surface, where they can finally be heard again. When the authorities finally learned of Dr. Aneta Wilczek's unauthorized expedition to the Steinwald site, they summoned her for questioning. The tone was not one of admiration for her discovery, but of irritation, of bureaucratic discomfort. The Polish Institute of National Remembrance preferred control, sanctioned contained research, and what Wilczek had unearthed threatened to spill into something far more chaotic. Yet the photographs she presented of the ruined foundations, the recovered fragments, and, most disturbingly, the document bearing the words Die dritte Klasse, fertiggestellt, could not be ignored. The phrase was chilling in its simplicity. The third class, completed. It implied an order fulfilled, an experiment concluded, a group erased with the sterile efficiency of a laboratory record. The Institute reluctantly reopened its internal inquiry, and for the first time in decades, official investigators turned their gaze toward the forgotten forests of Steinwald. Ground-penetrating radar scans revealed anomalies beneath the soil, patterns suggesting long trenches, some narrow, others rectangular, consistent with buried structures or mass graves. Archaeologists were hesitant to proceed. The site was remote, unstable, its terrain prone to sinkholes, and yet something compelled them to dig. They worked in silence, methodically brushing away layers of dirt that hadn't been disturbed in nearly 80 years. Within days, they found the first remnants of a foundation wall, part of what appeared to be a small facility, modest in scale but meticulously constructed. Its corridors had been built partially underground, perhaps to conceal whatever occurred inside from aerial reconnaissance. At the northern edge of the ruins, near what might once have been a service entrance, lay several small metallic tags, each stamped with a number, 21 in total. No names, no symbols, just sequential numbers from 1 to 21. The excavation halted when the first bone fragments surfaced, a tiny radius bone, consistent with that of a child approximately 9 years old. Forensic teams confirmed human remains within days. But what shocked them wasn't merely the age of the victims. It was the pattern. The bones showed no signs of traditional execution, no bullet wounds, no blunt trauma. Instead, they bore faint etchings, symmetrical marks on the ribs and femurs that suggested incisions made during post-mortem examination. Someone had studied these children, measured them, perhaps dissected them, and then buried them with mechanical precision. News of the discovery reached the media before officials could contain it. The headlines returned. The lost class found. Children of Steinwald unearthed. Echoes of Program Grau. The story became a national obsession once more, but now the tone shifted from curiosity to horror. What had been speculation was now tangible, real. The children of Class 3B had not vanished into myth. They had been taken, examined, and erased. Wilczek became both a symbol and a scapegoat. Her name filled newspapers. Her face appeared on nightly broadcasts. But behind closed doors, she was warned to stop. Government representatives suggested that continued investigation could destabilize historical relations between Poland and Germany. Some colleagues accused her of sensationalizing tragedy for fame. Yet she continued her work, driven not by ambition, but by something deeper. A sense that the photograph itself demanded completion, that the faces within it would not let her rest until the final truth surfaced. She returned often to the archive where the photograph was kept. Late at night, when the building was empty, she would sit before it in the dim light of her desk lamp. Sometimes she thought she could hear faint sounds, the scratch of pencils, the murmur of children reciting lessons, the echo of footsteps down wooden hallways. She told herself it was imagination, the mind's cruel trick in the presence of unbearable loss. But then she noticed something impossible. The photograph had changed. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. A shift in light, perhaps, or the angle of a shadow. But one night, as she stared at the faces of the children, she realized that Dawid, the boy at the center, was no longer looking directly at the camera. His eyes had turned slightly to the right, as if glancing toward something or someone just outside the frame. She blinked, leaned closer, and saw that a faint shape had emerged behind the class, in the same place where earlier analysis had noted the blurred figure. The outline of a man in a gray hat, more distinct now than before. She called the archivist, who dismissed her observation as lighting distortion caused by aging chemicals in the photographic paper. But Wilczek was certain the image was altering itself, or revealing something long concealed within its grain. In the following weeks, she documented every detail, photographing the photograph at regular intervals, comparing changes, measuring shadows. Each time, the figure grew clearer. Then, one morning, the photograph was gone. The archive's security system showed no break-in, no entry logs, no missing keys. Yet the glass case stood empty, the dust undisturbed. The only clue was a single slip of paper resting where the photo had been. Written in Polish, in a hand Wilczek did not recognize, were the words, "Stop looking at them, they already see you." For days afterward, she avoided mirrors, avoided the windows of her apartment, where reflections seemed to waver too long after she moved. Friends noticed her paranoia, the way she checked her phone repeatedly, how she startled at sudden noises. But what terrified her most wasn't the possibility of being followed. It was the idea that the photograph hadn't been stolen, but had simply moved on its own. The investigation continued without her. The Steinwald site yielded more remains, each accompanied by small glass vials and rusted metal instruments. Chemical analysis revealed traces of chloroform and ether, and faint residues of substances used historically for neurological studies. Historians confirmed that Program Grau had been funded directly by the SS Ahnenerbe, operating under the guise of ethnographic research. The aim according to a recovered memo, had been to observe the development of linguistic cognition absent cultural interference. In other words, they had sought to isolate children from all forms of language to determine what speech, if any, emerged naturally. It was an experiment to find the pure tongue, a concept as horrifying as it was unscientific. The children of Class Thurlsbody B, it seemed, had been selected for this purpose because of their mixed heritage, Polish, Jewish, Romani, representing what Nazi ideology called degenerate convergence. They were the control group in a study meant to prove racial superiority. But something had gone wrong at Steinwald. A recently declassified German telegram sent from the camp in late December 1941 contained a cryptic message. Subject group deteriorating rapidly. Silence persists. Observation terminated. Silence persists. It became the chilling refrain of every subsequent report. The researchers had tried to raise the children in absolute quiet, depriving them of speech, of names, of song, of the comforting cadence of language itself. The children had ceased responding, their eyes empty, their lips still. The experiment ended not with results, but with death, by neglect, by fear, or perhaps by the simple withdrawal of the will to live. In the aftermath of Steinwald's exposure, Wilczek attempted to piece together the final days of the facility. Eyewitness accounts, from locals, long suppressed, began to surface. One woman, now in her 90s, claimed she had seen soldiers burning papers and crates near the forest in early 1942. Another recalled the sound of singing, high, fragile voices echoing from the trees before abruptly stopping. Yet official reports mentioned no survivors. Still, the most haunting clue came from a piece of film recovered near the site during excavation. It was badly damaged, its nitrate base nearly turned to dust. But when digitally restored, it revealed a few seconds of moving image. A camera panning slowly across a snow-covered clearing. Rows of small figures standing motionless, facing the lens, and then a brief flicker. The image of Helena Gradowska, the teacher from Krakow, standing among them, her eyes hollow, her expression unreadable. The footage ended abruptly, the final frames warped by heat. But experts verified its authenticity. Somehow Helena had been taken too. Perhaps she had followed her students. Perhaps she had refused to let them face what awaited alone. Her fate, like theirs, was sealed in silence. Wilczek released the findings to the press under the title, "The Persistence of Silence." It was less an academic paper than a lament, an attempt to give voice to the voiceless. But not long after its publication, she vanished. Her car was found parked near the Vistula River, keys still in the ignition, her phone on the passenger seat. No sign of struggle, no body, only the faint impression of a single child's footprint in the mud by the water's edge. And then, 3 months later, another envelope arrived at the Krakow Historical Society. No return address. Inside was the original Class 3B photograph. The figure in the gray hat was now perfectly clear, his face visible for the first time. It was not the inspector, not any known officer. It was Wilczek. History bends where silence endures. If this story has kept you in its grip, if the chill of the past feels close enough to touch, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Because what comes next dives deeper into the darkness beneath Steinwald. The return of the photograph in that anonymous envelope marked a turning point, not only for the investigation but for the story itself. Because it was no longer about the past. It had begun to bleed into the present, reshaping itself around those who sought to expose it. When the archivists opened the envelope, they expected to see the same faded image that had become infamous worldwide. But what they held in their trembling hands was sharper, clearer, as though it had been reprinted yesterday. The grain was gone. The light, unnaturally even. The children's faces, still solemn, seemed alive again, their eyes reflecting something wet and uncomfortably aware. And in the back row, behind them, the face of Dr. Annetta Wilczek, expressionless but unmistakable, stood among the children, her outline blending with theirs. For days, the archivists refused to speak publicly. They sealed the photograph, placed it in storage, and filed a confidential report to the Ministry of Culture. But secrets never last, and within a week, the image was leaked. It spread across the internet like a shadow crawling over light. Forums lit up with debates. Was it a fabrication, a haunting, or evidence of something we were not meant to see? Photographic experts were divided. Some swore the image bore no sign of tampering. The emulsion, they claimed, was consistent with 1940s paper. Others said it was impossible. No photograph could change over time. Yet no one could explain why the signature on the back, the trembling, "Forgive me," they were not meant to be forgotten, had vanished completely. It was as if the message had been rewritten, not erased, but consumed. The ministry formed a temporary task force to address what they called a matter of cultural disturbance. The lead investigator, a stoic man named Marek Lewandowski, approached the case with the skepticism of someone accustomed to superstition. But his tone shifted after only 2 weeks. He began to experience what he later described as lingering presences. While cataloging the photo, he claimed to hear faint noises, childlike whispers, overlapping and rhythmic, like recitations in an unfamiliar language. He dismissed it as auditory fatigue, until one evening when his assistant, working in the next room, froze mid-sentence and asked, "Do you hear them too?" The recordings captured during that night remain classified, but witnesses who reviewed them described a sequence of sounds faintly resembling breathing, followed by what might have been the scrape of chalk against a blackboard. When the audio was amplified, fragments of Polish words appeared, then German, then something else entirely, a patternless string of syllables that resembled neither language nor nonsense. The linguists brought in to analyze the sounds called it proto-speech, utterances that mimic language without forming it, the kind of sounds children might make when trying to remember how to speak after long silence. Within the task force, fear began to spread quietly. Several members resigned, claiming health issues. 2 reported recurring dreams of standing in a classroom filled with snow, where the windows were covered in frost, and the desks stood empty except for notebooks filled with numbers. 21, repeating endlessly across each page. Lewandowski, now obsessed, requested access to all remaining program Grau files stored in Berlin. He traveled there in late autumn, visiting the Bundesarchive, where the surviving Annenerbe records were kept in the sub-basement. It was a labyrinth of cold concrete corridors, sealed cabinets, and stale air that carried the scent of dust and forgotten truths. With the help of a German historian named Dr. Erich Neumann, Lewandowski combed through thousands of pages until they found something, an unmarked file folder within the Rassenforschung section containing photographs, notes, and a single index card that referenced Steinwald, Gruppe 3, Beobachtungsphase abgeschlossen, Januar 1943. Observation vase complete. Attached to the file was a small photograph, much like the Krakow one, but this time taken inside a dimly lit room. The children were sitting at desks, their eyes closed, hands folded on the table as though in prayer. Behind them stood a man in a gray hat, his face obscured by shadow. On the wall, faint writing could be seen, chalk letters in German spelling, Schweigen ist Reinheit, silence is purity. Neumann, pale and trembling, insisted on ending the review session immediately. But Lewandowski scanned the photo before leaving. That night, back in his hotel, he enlarged the image. The gray hat, the tall frame, the posture. He froze. It was not Wilczek this time, not an officer, but himself. He returned to Poland the next day, silent, refusing to discuss what he had seen. His colleagues noticed the change, his voice softer, slower, as if each word cost him effort. Soon after, he stopped speaking altogether. His last written note to the task force consisted of only 4 words. They are learning again. By winter 2020, the investigation was quietly disbanded. The Steinwald site was sealed by the government under the pretext of environmental protection, its coordinates removed from public maps. But the photograph continued to circulate online, where it took on a life of its own. People who downloaded the image began reporting anomalies, computers freezing, speakers emitting faint static that, when analyzed spectrally, matched the same proto-speech pattern recorded in the archive. Some claimed the faces in the photograph changed when viewed at night, the eyes shifting slightly to meet the observer's gaze. A digital forensics expert from London uploaded the image to a server for analysis. Within hours, the file multiplied, replicating itself under different names, appearing in unrelated folders, as if it were alive. He deleted his hard drive, but the file returned days later in his email drafts, attached to a blank message titled, "Do you hear them?" He deleted everything again. A week later, his apartment was found abandoned. The only object left on his desk was a printed copy of the Classlibrary's Thoan. B. Photograph, a handwritten note beneath it. Silence persists. Meanwhile, researchers attempting to trace the identity of the man in the gray hat reached a grim conclusion. Among surviving Nazi personnel records, they found reference to an Obersturmführer Heinrich Falkenstein, whose initials, HF, matched the documents Wilczek had found. Falkenstein had been the director of Program Grau and had vanished in early 1945. Witnesses claimed he fled toward Dord, Switzerland, carrying several boxes of scientific material. But he never resurfaced. His name was absent from all post-war tribunals. No grave, no family, no trace, until one historian noticed something hidden in plain sight. In a photograph taken during the Nuremberg trials, dated 1946, Falkenstein was seen in the crowd among journalists, watching, not judged, his face partially obscured by a gray hat. As news of these revelations spread, reports of auditory hallucinations tied to the photograph intensified. Teachers in Krakow claimed to hear children's voices during winter mornings, faint and distant, singing in a language no one could identify. A janitor cleaning the old school building on Uleka Świerkowa, now converted into municipal offices, reported finding tiny handprints on the inside of a locked basement door. When police inspected the site, they found no sign of entry, only the faint scent of chalk and something else. Ozone, like the air after lightning. The building was evacuated days later after multiple employees fell ill, complaining of headaches and whispers echoing through the halls. It was then that the Ministry of Culture, under pressure from both media and public fear, ordered the destruction of the photograph. The archivists protested, citing its historical value, but the decree was absolute. The print was removed from its case, placed in an incineration chamber, and burned under supervision. Witnesses recall that as the photograph blackened and curled, a sound filled the room, a thin, piercing hum, almost like a child humming a lullaby through closed lips. The sound grew louder until the last fragment of the image turned to ash. And yet the following morning, another envelope arrived. No return address, no markings. Inside, once again, the photograph of Claes Thurl B, untouched, unburned, its surface immaculate. But this time, there was something new. The children were still there. So was Wilczek. So was the man in the gray hat. But now, standing at the edge of the group, just barely within the frame, was a fourth figure. Marek Lewandowski. It was as if the photograph was rewriting history in real time, claiming those who tried to expose it. By this point, the story had become legend, a ghost that drifted between history and digital folklore. Skeptics called it mass hysteria. Believers said it was retribution, the persistence of the silenced, demanding remembrance. But in the corridors of power, whispers circulated of something worse, that the experiment at Steinwald had succeeded after all, that in trying to create pure silence, they had birthed something that now lingered in it. Something that learned, something that remembered. The final entry in the ministry's classified report on the case, dated 2021, reads simply, Subject, photograph through B. Recommendation, containment, impossible. Dissemination, accelerating. Observation, terminated. If you've stayed with this story this far, if the silence between words feels heavier now than before, don't forget to like this video. It keeps these stories alive, and perhaps it keeps us seen before the silence grows too deep. By 2022, the story of Claes Thurl B had passed beyond the threshold of history and into something else entirely. What had begun as a rediscovery of a forgotten photograph had become an infection of memory, an echo that refused to remain contained by time. News outlets stopped reporting on it after a series of unexplained incidents involving journalists, computers freezing mid-broadcast, camera feeds flickering, and, in one case, a live stream abruptly cutting to black as the image of 21 children appeared for a single frame before vanishing. Official statements blamed technical interference. Those who saw it live spoke of hearing, for a brief instant, the sound of children breathing through static. The Ministry of Culture tried once more to erase the story. The archived reports were sealed, servers wiped, and all physical evidence, including the reappeared photograph, was placed in a lead container and stored in a secure military facility outside Wrocław. But silence, once created, seemed to carry a will of its own. Within a month, personnel stationed at the facility began filing strange reports. Whispers in corridors, pages missing from binders, lights flickering in rhythm with soft tapping sounds, as if small hands pressed gently from the other side of the walls. An internal memo, dated March 14, 2022, recorded an event that would never reach the public. A night shift guard found the container door ajar. Inside, the photograph lay on the floor, face up. In it, the number of children had changed. There were now 22. No one could identify the new face. It was not a child. It was not any of the known adults connected to the case. The figure stood at the far right of the group, half turned toward the others, half toward the camera, and though the features were faint, the eyes were unmistakable, open, glassy, almost reflective. The guard resigned that night, refusing to speak of what he'd seen again. The container was resealed, cameras were installed, but the number in the photograph never returned to 21. It was around this time that a British historian, Dr. Alice Moreau, became obsessed with the phenomenon. Having specialized in post-war archival disappearance cases, she saw in class Thrm B, not just tragedy, but pattern. She compiled hundreds of testimonies, letters, and photographs from across Europe, each one bearing traces of missing classrooms, groups of children documented briefly during the occupation before vanishing from record. At first, the similarities seemed coincidental, but as she aligned them chronologically, a horrifying symmetry emerged. Each class had been photographed within a week of an Initiative 12 inspection. Each photograph had the same composition, the same alignment, the same background light, the same blurred figure at the edge. The photographer, it seemed, had followed a script. Dr. Moreau began to suspect that the photographs themselves were part of the experiment, a control mechanism. The images were not souvenirs, they were instruments, documents of observation designed to capture not just faces, but responses to being seen. She hypothesized that Program Grau's goal extended beyond linguistic deprivation. It sought to study how human identity collapses under erasure. The photographs, she argued, were both record and replication, the final step in erasing the self, to freeze it, preserve it, and then let the copy consume the original. Her paper, Echoes of Vision, Memory Contagion in Nazi Documentation Practices, was never published. 3 days after submitting it for peer review, the server hosting her files crashed. Her office at King's College London was found emptied. Only a single photograph remained on her desk, the Class 3B image printed at high resolution. The gray hat figure now stood directly beside her chair, visible even though the photo had been taken 80 years earlier. What investigators could not explain was that the photo paper bore fresh fingerprints. Hers. When British authorities reached out to Polish officials for cooperation, they discovered that nearly all records related to the Steinwald excavation had been classified under NATO jurisdiction. The reasoning: potential biotechnological contamination. But those who had handled the remains insisted that nothing biological remained, only bones and soil. The secrecy, then, was not about health. It was about control. Something in those archives, perhaps even in the photograph itself, had become ungovernable. In the following months, digital anomalies multiplied. Files labeled 3B began appearing in government servers in multiple countries, each containing fragments of the same image. Some were static, corrupted. Others displayed new figures or altered expressions. When investigators tried to trace the source, the data pointed to random origins: public libraries, school networks, even personal laptops unconnected to the internet. It was as though the image were reproducing itself through contact with human curiosity, feeding on the act of observation. And then, something even stranger occurred. An independent filmmaker from Warsaw, attempting to create a documentary about the case, began receiving emails from unknown senders. Each contained short audio files, faint recordings of what sounded like children repeating words in a loop. When slowed down, the syllables formed coherent Polish phrases: "Jesteśmy tu," "We are here." The filmmaker, believing it to be an elaborate hoax, incorporated the audio into his editing timeline. But when he rendered the footage, he found that every frame of his documentary had been replaced by a still image. The photograph of Class 3B, flickering like an old film reel. In the center of the frame, text appeared for a single second before vanishing. "We remember your voice." He never completed the film. Days later, his editing suite, caught fire. The hard drives melted. Yet investigators found no signs of electrical fault. Only a thin residue on the walls, analyzed later and identified as silver nitrate, the chemical used in developing old photographs. That was the moment when people began to whisper that the silence of Steinwald had never truly ended, that the experiment had created something intangible, a form of resonance between image and observer. The children had been deprived of language, their voices sealed in stillness. But in that deprivation, they had become something else. Fragments of pure perception, entities that existed only when seen. Every time the photograph was looked at, they awoke, if only for a moment, reclaiming what was taken, the act of being remembered. Late that winter, a journalist named Katarzyna Borek received a package at her Krakow apartment. Inside was a USB drive labeled, "For those who still listen." On it was a folder containing 21 video files, each named after a number. The files, when played, showed silent footage of classrooms, empty, dust-filled, with desks arranged neatly and sunlight flickering through frost-covered windows. In the final video, titled 22.mp4, the camera pans slowly across one such classroom. On the blackboard, faint chalk writing read, "Lekcja trwa." The lesson continues. Then a reflection appeared in the glass of a window, 21 small figures standing behind the camera, watching. Borek uploaded the footage online. Within hours, her post went viral. People around the world watched, rewatched, and shared it. But something strange followed. Reports from viewers claiming their screens would freeze on random frames, revealing new faces behind the reflection, sometimes their own. A wave of panic spread, forcing platforms to remove the videos. Yet copies continued circulating in encrypted groups, spreading like infection through curiosity. Authorities called for calm, but by then the silence had already deepened. Those who had worked directly with the recovered photograph began to vanish again. One archivist walked into the frozen Wisła River, leaving her coat and gloves on the bank. Another boarded a train to Germany and never arrived. Marek Lewandowski's apartment was found undisturbed, except for one thing, pinned to the wall above his bed, a series of photographs, each a print of class through B, each slightly different. In the final image, all 22 figures faced away from the camera, staring into a blinding white horizon, as though waiting for something or someone to return. Then, one evening in late 2023, a tourist visiting Krakow took a photograph of the old school building on Ulica Świerkowa, now abandoned again after several failed attempts to repurpose it. When she reviewed the image on her phone, she noticed something strange. In one of the windows, 21 faces stared back, small faces, pale and distant, arranged neatly in rows. She deleted the photo, but it reappeared in her gallery an hour later, brighter, clearer, and now showing 22 faces. Hers was the newest. The story by then had passed entirely into legend. Skeptics dismissed it as digital folklore, an internet-age ghost story. But among those who had seen the photograph with their own eyes, few dared to deny its power. They spoke of a silence that hummed, a frequency too low for hearing, but heavy enough to feel, pressing against the chest, like unseen weight. They said that once you'd looked at the image long enough, you could never unhear that silence again. It would follow you into sleep, into reflection, into every screen's faint glow. And in the corners of Europe's oldest archives, curators began to report something new. Old wartime photographs rearranging themselves overnight, groups shifting, faces turned slightly toward the lens, as if the lost were slowly organizing themselves, preparing for something larger than remembrance. If you can still hear the faint static in this story, if somewhere between words you feel that silence stirring, remember to subscribe and keep listening, because what follows next reveals the final layer of this haunting. What happened after the silence finally began to speak. By the beginning of 2024, the story of Class 3's B had become a quiet obsession across the world. Academic circles dismissed it as myth, conspiracy, or an elaborate psychological experiment. But others, historians, journalists, investigators, could not look away. There was something in the story that refused to end, something that pulled people back toward the silence, toward the photograph, as if the image itself demanded witnesses. Krakow had turned into a pilgrimage site for those who believed. The abandoned school on Ulica Świerkowa, sealed for years, drew visitors who left small offerings by the rusted gate: chalk, children's shoes, notebooks, folded paper cranes. On winter nights, the snow gathered softly over these relics, erasing them by morning. And sometimes, when the street was empty, people claimed to see faint lights flickering behind the school's windows, though there was no electricity left inside. The city council, overwhelmed by the influx of curiosity seekers, ordered the demolition of the building. The work began in late February, but on the first day of excavation, the construction crew refused to continue. In the foundation beneath what had once been the assembly hall, they found rows of old photographs embedded between the bricks, sealed there like offerings, hundreds of prints, all identical to the original Class 3B image. Each one had faded differently, each one warped by time, yet none bore signs of exposure to air or moisture. They had been preserved in absolute silence. The demolition halted. The photographs were transferred to a secure site at Jagiellonian University. The team assigned to catalog them began the delicate process of separation and scanning. But the images resisted. The scanners malfunctioned. The screens displayed unreadable static. When one technician attempted to handle the photos under infrared light, the paper began to pulse faintly, as though alive, emitting a low hum that vibrated through the glass of the display table. What they discovered next changed everything. Among the hundreds of photographs, one stood out, slightly different in composition. The same children, the same teacher, the same arrangement. But in this version, every face had its eyes closed, and the man in the gray hat was missing entirely. In his place stood a blackboard covered in words, faint but legible. Written in chalk were two lines in German: Wir sprechen nicht mehr. Wir hören. We no longer speak. We listen. The discovery sent shockwaves through the research community. Linguists, psychologists, and historians gathered to debate its meaning. Some interpreted it as an admission, a message left by those conducting the experiment. Others believed it to be something else. A message not from the perpetrators, but from the children themselves. The act of silence, they said, had reversed. It was no longer the oppressor's tool. It was the echo of defiance, the only language left to the forgotten. But as the debate raged, strange things began happening around the university. Students working in the archive reported hearing faint classroom noises, chalk scraping, chairs moving, whispers repeating lessons that hadn't been spoken in 80 years. The janitors found footprints in the dust, small and unshod, leading to walls that ended in concrete. Security cameras captured brief flickers of movement in empty corridors, shadows too short to be adult. When footage was reviewed, the timestamp would reset, erasing the moment completely. And then one night, the building lost power. When the lights returned, Every photograph in the collection had been rearranged. The archivists found them spread across the floor in a perfect grid, rows and columns forming a vast mosaic. At first it seemed random, but viewed from above, through the security feed, the pattern revealed itself. It was the outline of a face. Not one of the children, not Wilczek, not Falkenstein. It was a composite. Hundreds of eyes, mouths, and shadows merging into a single expression. Something almost human, almost pleading, formed from silence itself. The government immediately seized the collection. The archive was closed. Officially, the photographs were relocated for conservation. Unofficially, they were never seen again. That should have been the end. But the story persisted, whispering through corners of the internet, in encrypted channels and private groups. Users began sharing new versions of the image. Low resolution, grainy, impossible to verify. Each one was slightly different, as if the photograph continued to evolve. In some, the children's mouths were open, as if speaking. In others, the faces blurred, replaced by unfamiliar ones. Someone noticed that when the images were layered digitally, the resulting composite spelled out faint letters. They formed a phrase, Lectia trois. The lesson continues. That same phrase appeared again in April 2024, this time graffitied across the wall of the old Steinwald site in letters over a meter high. The area had long been closed to the public, surrounded by dense forest and surveillance cameras. Yet the writing appeared overnight, with no signs of intrusion. Beneath it, carved roughly into the concrete, was a series of numbers. 21 repeated 3 times, followed by 22. No one claimed responsibility. Shortly afterward, a Polish television crew filming a documentary on the wartime disappearances decided to visit the area. Their footage was never broadcast, but one surviving clip, leaked online months later, showed their final moments at the site. The camera shaking, static rising, the sound of wind heavy through the microphone. Then faintly, a chorus of children's voices murmuring in the background. The cameraman turned toward the sound, panning across the trees, and for a fraction of a second, between the trunks, 21 small silhouettes stood motionless in the fog. The clip cut to black. Forensic analysts confirmed that the figures were not superimposed. After that, belief turned to fear. By late 2024, isolated incidents appeared across Europe and beyond. In Berlin, a historian working on wartime archives vanished, leaving behind a wall covered in pinned photographs, all of classrooms, all with missing students. In Buenos Aires, a man reported receiving an email from an unknown address containing a single attachment, the Class B image. He opened it. Within minutes, every photograph on his device, family pictures, work files, random downloads, had changed. All now showed the same thing, a classroom under snow. He smashed the computer, but the image returned on his phone 2 days later. The phenomenon spread faster than anyone could contain it. By the time researchers understood, it was too late. The image had become a pattern, a kind of contagion transmitted not through data, but through attention. To see it was to carry it. Every copy shared, every retelling, every whispered recounting of the lost class gave it form again. And so, the silence multiplied, finding hosts in the living to sustain the memory of the lost. A final report by the remnants of the disbanded task force, now operating in secrecy, outlined what they called echo events, instances where individuals who had viewed the photograph began to experience shared hallucinations of classrooms, children, and faint murmurs repeating nonsensical syllables. But the syllables weren't random. Linguistic analysis revealed that When pieced together, they formed fragments of lost words, names, places, prayers, spoken in over a dozen languages. It was as if the silence itself were trying to remember. The last recorded echo event occurred in December 2024 in a hospital in southern Poland. A nurse, alone on the night shift, reported hearing what she thought was a radio broadcast playing from an empty ward. The voice was faint, but rhythmic, like a teacher reading aloud. When she entered the room, she found no radio, no sound, only a single object resting on a bed, an old photograph in a cracked frame. 21 children, one teacher, and in the far corner, reflected in the glass, her own face. She destroyed the photograph, but it made no difference. The following morning, every reflective surface in the hospital, mirrors, windows, polished instruments, fogged over from within, leaving small handprints that slowly faded as daylight came. There were no further reports after that. Or perhaps there were, and no one dared record them. Today, the building on Ulica Świerkowa stands in ruins, fenced off and overgrown. No one enters after sunset. Locals say the air grows still there, that snow never melts on that ground. Some swear they can still hear faint laughter from beneath the earth when the wind shifts. Others claim that if you stand by the fence long enough, you'll hear a whisper behind you, soft, childlike, asking a single question. Do you see us now? And maybe that is what this story was always about. Not ghosts, not science, not the failures of history, but the cost of forgetting. Because perhaps silence isn't the absence of sound. Perhaps it's the echo that remains when memory itself becomes aware. So as this story closes, if you've listened until now, if you've felt the weight of their silence pressing just behind your thoughts, don't let it fade. Like this video, share it, keep it alive, because remembrance is resistance. And in the dark corners of forgotten classrooms, somewhere, the lesson continues still.